Hi, I'm Susan Orlean. I'm the author of the library book and the proud owner of Schindler's Kalis House in Los Angeles, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Topeka, Kansas is the home of the famous Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, the one that ruled against segregation back in the 50s. It's also where Annette and Katrina of Katrina and the Waves grew up. It's where Will Wheaton of Star Trek used to party with Penn Gillette. It's where Dr. Phil started a health club with his dad in 1971, well before being discovered by Oprah when the beef industry sued her.
It's all true. Just look it up.
And it's also the home of Plains Modern, a small but intrepid group battling to save Kansas's modernist heritage, specifically one particular office building. Joining us today are architect and professor Michael Grogan of Plains Modern and the group's president, Paul Post. And now, someone who's all too familiar with trying to save modernist office buildings, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Modernist office buildings are a hard challenge for preservationists. People just don't tend to fall in love in office buildings, either with the building or each other. Unlike modernist houses, which have rich, heartwarming stories about moms and grandpas and barbecues and quirky architects and kids opening gifts at the holidays, all more than good enough for the Hallmark Channel, office buildings have memories of endless staff meetings, irritating colleagues, unpleasant reorganizations and layoffs, and even racial injustice and persecution. In Durham, North Carolina, where I live, there's a gorgeous Milton Small office building downtown, originally designed for an insurance company. You can see it at ncmodernist.org/small. With cherry and mahogany walls, tall ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass, terrazzo floors, it's as good an example of mid-century modernism as you can find in any mid-sized city. The insurance company loved it. But later on, some corporate shuffling closed the location, and it sat vacant for years, which is never good. Later, the city of Durham bought it, and one would think the city would match this showcase building with a similar government function, like economic development, or lease it to a pro-business group like the Chamber of Commerce, or give favorable terms to a huge company like Apple for an Apple store. But no, our fair city decided it would become the police headquarters.
Yeah.
All that beautiful wood and stone and glass work was completely lost on the cops, who, of course, hated the building for 25 years. And rightly so. It was never designed to be a police station. Would you turn a hospital into a truck stop? Would you turn a refinery into a health spa? Sure, you could do it, but those things never should happen. The police made many modifications, most of them minor, to the building, and after 25 years finally persuaded the city to build them a new, very conventional building a few miles away. But now we have that vacant modernist office building again, in need of repairs ranging in estimates from $5 to $17 million, and the city has spent years soliciting and rejecting various development proposals. What's more, the modernist building has emerged as a racial issue. Resentment against it from the black community because of significant abuses by the police who were headquartered there over decades, has turned into a call for the building's destruction. Police actions against the black community are real and important, and they must be corrected. But taking this building down won't help that situation at all. It's not the building's fault. It's the city's for putting the police there in the first place. This building could become an amazing office again, or apartments, or condos, or, hey, the Office for Economic Development, or a Chamber of Commerce, or an Apple store. Yet there's enough resentment out there, and little love, except by preservationists, so the City Council will be taking yet more development proposals, this time likely requiring the building's demolition. A decision is expected in spring 2023. Maybe Hallmark could shoot one of their much-loved Christmas movies there and generate a little love. I hope so. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architect and professor Michael Grogan taught at the Rhode Island School of Design, Northeastern University, and Kansas State University, pursuing preservation and adaptive reuse for modernist buildings. He is a founder and director of the preservation group Plains Modern and has been president of AIA Kansas. Paul Post is the president of Plains Modern and has been a member of the Topeka Landmarks Commission since 2014. He supports music and film festivals and likes long walks on the beach. But most recently, he and Michael and Plains Modern have come together to save the Docking State Office Building in downtown Topeka from destruction. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, we appreciate this opportunity to speak with both of you and the audience.
Now, Paul and Michael, before we get started with docking, I'm intrigued with the Topeka Airport, which is not a modernist building. But despite huge runways and the fact it used to have about 200,000 passengers a year, it's now one of the largest airports in the world without commercial service.
What?
What happened there, guys?
Paul, I'll defer to you on this one.
Yeah, I can probably answer that question. It used to be Forbes Air Force Base, and it was a large base that was in business from World War II, the mid-1940s, until 1972. And so that's why it has a large runway, because it was built to service, for example, B-52 bombers and other large planes.
But how do you go from 200,000 passengers a year to zero?
Well, the airlines, over time, there was deregulation, and there were no longer any government subsidies for smaller airports. I mean, we have big runways, but it was a small airport, and so when the subsidies evaporated, the airlines pulled out. The other problem is that Kansas City International Airport is a little over an hour's drive away, so people can hop in their car, go over there, and catch a plane really almost anywhere. So it's a bit of a problem to try and compete with an airport that size.
How big is Topeka?
The city is about 127,000 people. The county, which if you include that as the metropolitan area, which it should be, is probably about 185,000.
Okay.
Now, Michael, you're no stranger to modernism. In fact, you worked on renovating the Edersheim House in Larchmont, which was designed by one of our favorite architects, Paul Rudolph. Tell us about working on that project.
Oh, yeah, that was an interesting process as well. And I do want to clarify that he was not the original architect on the project. So it was a firm that I understand was called Finn and Genter, and I have not found much on them at all.
Okay.
Even newspapers.com and other kind of Avery Index searches and stuff. But they designed the house in the late 50s, and in the 80s, Paul Rudolph was retained by the Edersheims to do a series of additions and modifications, including this beautiful canopy system on the front of the house, and he altered the sequence of entry and stuff. It's quite elegant, which we preserved that or restored it. It was in kind of bad shape. And a number of other little areas, in the interior, you put in a sunken conversation seating platform and added an enclosed pool room. I guess there was an exterior pool, I think, and he enclosed it and put a little clerestory lantern above it and some other kind of just piecemeal modifications added to the second story of the garage. All these things. So my task originally was just to redo the master bathroom suite, which didn't have really anything of Rudolph in it. It was kind of a hodgepodge of styles. And a lot of the interior spaces were like that. They were definitely not Paul Rudolph in most cases. So in the tradition of project scope creep, this went from a master bathroom modification to a kitchen modification to a whole 6,000 square foot renovation. And I added an 850 square foot link that connects the main house to the garage.
Okay.
But with that, with the Paul Rudolph elements, of which there were like 12 key things, we restored them, saved them. There's, in some cases, there were these like timbers out in the backyard, which we loved and thought they need to remain, but they're in bad shape. So we decided to actually replace them with the same design and layout in granite. So now there are these granite little steps on the side yard. But it was an interesting project that lasted 10 years.
Wow.
And it was finally completed in 2020.
I read that there was an NFT on the house.
Oh, yes. So once it was completed, the owners, the Joseph family, they decided to move to Sarasota, Florida, and decided to put it on the market. And, of course, aimed high on the original asking price, and then kind of quickly lowered it. I think it was 6.5 million, and they lowered it to 5.9 and so on. So at a certain point, they thought, well, maybe we ought to try this out, this whole NFT, non-fungible token strategy of putting it on some kind of auction exchange. I forget which one. And then people could get, I guess, cryptocurrency on it, I guess was the structure. It wasn't a true NFT in the sense that the purchaser would own any, I guess, artistic rights. They wouldn't own my drawings, for instance. They wouldn't own anything else of that kind of nature. So really, it was a typical real estate transaction through this forum of a kind of NFT auction exchange, I guess is what you might call it. It did not work. He didn't get any bids for a sufficient amount.
Okay. I thought that was a very creative approach.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, and it got a lot of interesting press, with some of the online architectural journals and Yahoo Finance and so on and so forth. They did not have the good photographs, unfortunately. I retained Albert Vasurka with Esto to photograph the house upon completion. So that hasn't really gotten published anywhere, unfortunately, and they're really excellent photos, of course. So there's a lot of photos that others took, including like the owner and the realtor. Those are the ones that sort of got disseminated in all this media. So that's kind of unfortunate, because the good photos I have, but no one sort of asked me to have them published.
Hey, we'll publish them, Michael, on our Rudolph website.
Oh, yeah. No, I'd be glad to share it.
It mentions you.
Yeah. So let's talk more about that.
That'd be great.
So that was a truly interesting project. But that was one thing, too, with the way it was disseminated in the media, that a lot of them did say Paul Rudolph designed house. And that kind of changes the discussion quite a bit. If indeed the whole house was a Paul Rudolph, then this most certainly has to become a full preservation project in total, right?
Right.
And this was not. Most of it was kind of junky and not well built, and different interior finishes and things. So my job was to sort of organize what was mostly not a Paul Rudolph house, and then preserve the key elements that were indeed Paul Rudolph additions, modifications. So that's kind of the big, let's say, narrative thing on that particular project that I definitely want to clarify. And I had like our newspaper change put in an editor's note. Okay, it was not designed by Paul Rudolph. It was designed by this other firm, and
Okay. Michael, in December of 2020, you published an article on Plains Martin on the Docomomo website. Was this the start of the organization?
Not exactly, but like I said, the Plains Modern organization, generally speaking, our mission statement is far more general. So in some sense that was, but I don't want to take any kind of credit for that. I named the article Plains Modern, so we kind of adopted that more recently. But certainly there are other people like Robert McLaughlin and Chris Fine and a bunch of other architects who are strong advocates for modernist heritage in Kansas. And actually those two authors also contributed essays, one of them on SJCF, the great firm in Wichita, Kansas, and the other, Christopher Fine, contributed an article on modernist houses in Kansas. So that was kind of the start of this idea that we should get an organization going, and then ultimately, hopefully, become a Docomomo chapter. So yeah, in a way that was a start, but not directly the start that really got activated by this particular docking building case. Now, in my article, I did conclude with the docking building, which at that point, to be honest, I wasn't overly familiar with, but I knew that was a hot preservation issue in Topeka and for the state. So I definitely want to make a brief but strong conclusion with that building as an example. But at the same time, Century 2, you talked to Celeste Rossette a while back about the Century 2 building in Wichita and the Wichita Public Library, which is a masterpiece of modern architecture. Both of those are still, I think they're in better shape now, but they're definitely threatened, or they have a kind of uncertain future. So that was part of it. And that's where Robert McLaughlin, for instance, his article really looked at the firm that conceived the library and wrote about their history. Really excellent firm that's still around.
So tell us about this docking state office building. In short, why is it important to save?
So from my standpoint, I think I can speak to some degree on behalf of Plains Modern on this. I would call it an architectural landmark, at least for the state of Kansas. It's funny, I found a postcard from about 1960 that says, quote, "The state office building considered by many architects as the most modern structure of its kind in the United States."
Wow.
Now, that's a postcard, but, postcards have a ring of truth in them sometimes. I think, it's a super innovative building. It sits right next to the Capitol. It's one block. It's on the adjoining parcel west of the Capitol. And the Capitol is an amazing building as well. And it makes a really nice counterpart to the state capitol. And as far as its innovative approach architecturally, it follows in the footsteps a little bit of like the UN Secretariat building in New York, and also the Lever House and other of these sort of new types of office buildings, right, after World War II concluded, that were starting to emerge in the United States. So I think I would put it in a category where it's one of the key early modernist office buildings. It's not the first, of course, but it's one of those that took the lessons of things like the UN Secretariat, just completed a few years before, and was arguably even more innovative in some ways. For instance, it had a double glazed curtain wall system set in aluminum frames. The aluminum frames were fabricated by the Benson Manufacturing Company in Kansas City, who normally made beer kegs. So it's kind of like they retooled to make this beautiful facade that's composed of thermopane glazing, right, a kind of insulated double pane glazing, as well as Vermont, I think it's Vermont greenstone, a kind of panel system using greenstone from Vermont, I guess. It's all integrated into it. And the curtain wall system, actually, other than the sealant not ever being replaced, as far as we could tell over the course of 70 whatever years, is in pretty good shape. It's probably, if they were going to do a full renovation, and that has been proposed, then they might probably replace the glazing and supplement the insulation and stuff for the spandrel panels. But it's a very innovative building in that regard. It had an innovative heating and cooling system that, of course, was experimental also, and ultimately wasn't maybe the best. That we wouldn't do that today. And there are other aspects. It integrates art by Bernard Poco, this is nicknamed Frazier, who was a local Kansas and kind of regional artist. So the building was both forward-looking architecturally, very modern, starkly modern, but also incorporated these bas-relief panels that were carved into the limestone facade on site, like in place, that look back at the kind of Kansas pioneering past. And so it's kind of reflection as an integration of art into the more forward-looking architecture of the building. It should be considered one of the most innovative works of modern architecture in the state of Kansas, definitely. And I think it reflects the time, a time generally of optimism. There's obviously problems in the 1950s, but a time of kind of optimism and innovation and, everything that followed World War II and the Great Depression, right? Economic boom, et cetera.
Now, Paul, when did the government fall out of love with this building and start thinking about getting rid of it?
Probably during the administration of former Governor Sam Brownback. About a dozen years ago, he was governor, and he was all about downsizing government, including the docking building. And so essentially what he did was he emptied it out, and in addition to downsizing government, he was all about private enterprise being superior to anything that government could possibly do. And so he entered into long-term lease contracts with a number of private owners of landlords, in other words, of properties here in Topeka that were willing to provide office space to state employees. And so in a fairly short period of time, it was emptied out, other than the first floor, which still contains the Capitol Police Department. But all of these employees were dispersed to other office space in the city that is primarily in private hands.
And did the building get leased out at that point, or did it stay vacant?
No, it's been vacant probably for at least the last 10 years, other than that, like I said, the first floor, which is the police department. And of interest is the fact that in the basement and sub-basement is the heating and cooling plant for the entire Capitol complex. So it services the docking building, the Capitol building, the Supreme Court building, and I think maybe one other state office building. And so Brownback was about to demolish it when somehow he discovered that he couldn't do so because the power plant, as they call it, actually the heating and cooling plant was in the basement. How he overlooked that, I don't know, but everybody knew about it. And so that put a halt to doing that. He had a rather convoluted idea about rebuilding it elsewhere on some sort of a lease purchase agreement. with a local power company, but the legislature nixed that. And of course, the legislature is also of the same party as Mr. Brownback, which was rather interesting, but they didn't think much of it. And so they vetoed the idea of building a totally separate heating and cooling plant.
Now, Michael, I understand that at some point in the last couple of years, about $130 million was earmarked for renovating the building, and then that kind of fell apart. What happened?
Yeah, so it dates back to a 2019 and early 2020 study that was commissioned by the state. They hired the architecture firm Clark Huseman out of Kansas City to prepare a study that looked at a few options for how the docking state office building could be reused in some capacity. And they concluded in their study, they were armed with a team of engineers and consultants to kind of really look at this in depth. And they had fundamentally two different options, and there were some sub options, but one of them was full renovation, which the report at least sort of implies is the preferred direction. And they say things like the structure is in stable condition. It can be easily reused to handle the needs of, state office employees at that point. And one of them was to tear down the top. It's technically, I guess, 11 stories, but it's really 9 stories of office space. Tear that down to the base, which is a 3-story base, and then add, I think it was 3 stories on top of it, or maybe 6 stories, as an option C and D, and they had a sub option. So there were 2 options, one which would obviously greatly modify the building, the other would just fully renovate it. So that got tabled because we know it happened in early 2020. This report was released in January of 2020. So obviously things changed, but nonetheless, about a year later, I think in January 2021, they decided to go for, I forget which committee it is, and maybe Paul can fill me in on that. But it was decided to earmark, I think, $120 million towards the full renovation of this thing. And the report the year before had estimated it would cost about $83 million to do a full adequate, renovation of this back into usable office space. So the $120 million presumably would be enough to cover it, barring other issues that arise, of course. So anyway, that came out, and basically the local, as Paul mentioned, a lot of these state agency employees, I think 1,500 or more were removed from the docking building in 2011. These agencies are now all over town in various privately owned office buildings for the most part. And so those owners, understandably, after the pandemic or during the pandemic, decided, well, this is not good. We don't want to lose our long-term leases with, the state, and that's understandable. So they kind of put a lot of pressure on various people to kind of question the idea of renovating the docking building and bringing all these agencies back into one place, which was the whole reason it was built in the first place in the 40s and 50s. The notion we have state agencies all over town. We need to get them kind of into one building that we own, so let's build a purpose-built state office building. That was the origin of it. And here we are 70 years later, kind of with the same discussions. That was January or February 21. In October of 21, the Joint Committee on State Building Construction had a session to approve either option A, which is a full renovation, or that option C, which was to tear it down to the bottom 3 floors and then build something new on top. Well, one of our state senators came in with an alternative proposal during this meeting to tear the whole thing down to the basement, right? Because again, the basement holds the utility power plant. Keep that intact, tear the whole building down and build a 3-story meeting and events center. And I guess it's under the presumption that, well, we don't want to build new office space because we don't want to remove long-term leases from the building owners in Topeka. So that somehow, despite that not being on the agenda and not being studied, not being vetted, not being a real proposal, somehow they were able to vote and approve that as the direction in that meeting. So October 21, now they're going to tear the building down completely. And that was ratified in December. There was a state finance council, I think, met, and they approved the funding for that, which I can't remember the numbers on that, but I think it was also like 124 million or something, 120 million.
Paul, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to throw at this situation? What's the next step?
Well, I am a retired attorney. I am not the attorney for Plains Modern. We have a law firm that we've retained. We have 2 fine attorneys, Philip Gregson and Amanda Vogelsberg, who are working on this project. I'm just a member and happen to be called a director, whatever that means. I'm not sure. But what we're doing from a legal standpoint, I can tell you that is we have initiated what's called judicial review. The governor's decision, it was the governor who actually decided that even though the building is on the National Register, that there were no feasible or prudent options other than tearing it down, which is a little ironic and not really honest about saying that, because there were two options in the state's own study by Clark Huseman, one being full restoration. So to say there were no feasible or prudent alternatives is not correct. But anyway, that's what happened. And so we, as Plains Modern, requested a judicial review of the governor's order. And now that is before a district judge here in Shawnee County, Kansas, in Topeka, who is looking at that to see whether or not the governor followed the Kansas Historic Preservation Act.
And is there any consequence for that? I mean, in a lot of cases, if a governor ignores one of these, small acts, it's just fine. They just ignore it.
Well, the legislature certainly is ignoring it, and the governor, having decided there were no feasible or prudent alternatives, is ignoring that statute. And that's where we're hoping that the judge, after hearing the lawyers' briefs and arguments, will say, no, it wasn't done right, and send it back for a do-over.
And this is a rather large building. This is over 400,000 square feet.
Yes, it's one of the larger buildings in Topeka.
Can the public help in your effort?
Yes, they can. The main thing that we're seeking right now are donations in any amount, because all of the donations are going to fund the litigation that we are pursuing, the judicial review proceedings that we're pursuing, and pay the attorneys for the fine work that they're doing. So donations of any amount are welcome and appreciated. That's probably one thing that people can do. The other thing is to join our group. There aren't any dues or membership fees. Again, we encourage people to send money, but you can join without having to pay a membership fee, become a member of Plains Modern. And you can do that on our website, which is plainsmodern.org, or we have a Facebook page, which also accepts donations, I believe.
Yeah, Plains Modern. It'll link to the same account. And then we have an Insta page, which does not have links and things as Instagram is, Plains Modern, KAN. But the Facebook actually is pretty good, where we're updating it with the updates and things that are unfolding kind of week by week on this saga, as I call it. We also have a change.org petition that people can sign. It's called Stop Demolition and Rehabilitate Knocking State Office Building in Kansas. Kind of funky name, but it was basically in the form of a letter that we're writing to the governor and the legislature about this. So the more signatures we can get, the better.
Let me ask you, gentlemen, let's play a few chess moves here. So let's say that you win your court case. In most jurisdictions, you can't force a governor or a legislature to spend the money. So what's their alternative? Just to let it sit vacant another 10 years?
Well, they have the money. That's not the problem. They have the money. In fact, it was the legislature in December, not last December, but December of 2021 that voted to renovate and restore the building. And then it was the legislature was out of session, so it was a smaller committee that essentially overruled the legislature and said, no, we're going to renovate it all right. We're going to renovate it down to grade and rebuild it. And so that's how that happened. But the money is there. That's not the problem. There's plenty of money.
Okay. I guess what I'm asking is, if you're able to win in court, can you actually get them to spend the money, or can they just say, we've moved on, we're just going to let it sit?
That's a good question.
Well, that's certainly an option they could follow.
Because certainly in other situations around the country, typically legislatures, once they've changed their mind, don't like to be told what to do,
I think that's true. But I think the thing here is that this building sits right next to the Capitol building. And actually starting in 2001 until probably 2021, $750 million were spent to totally renovate the Capitol building. And so this building sits right across the street, and it's not one that they want to fall into disuse and disrepair.
Is there any way that it can be turned into something else, like affordable housing?
Well, that certainly was an option. I talked to two different people who were willing to do that, but the legislature would not entertain those ideas.
Okay.
I think it's because it's sitting on the utility plant, right? So it's got to be maintained as
That's part of the problem.
Now, there could be alternatives. There are other state-owned office buildings that potentially could be sold off and utilized for housing. There's a need, I think, an increasing need in downtown Topeka for housing, generally speaking, both affordable and market. So that's something we've talked as a group. People in our group have spoken with developers and other interests in Topeka about those possibilities, where one could imagine putting offices currently housed elsewhere into the docking state office building and then selling off the other building for use as housing. I think that could be a good alternative.
Vacancy is always bad for these kind of buildings. I assume you all have been in the building and walked around. How far gone is it in terms of damage?
It's in excellent shape. I haven't been in there for some time, but others have. And essentially the problem is, I think our colleague Michael Gibson may have been in there. The problem is that there's just trash and junk sitting around, unused desks and cubicles and all that could simply be hauled away and thrown in a dumpster. I mean, as far as the condition of the building, it's quite good.
Yes.
There was some mention made early on, maybe several years ago, about someone discovering a rusty pipe, and that's going to happen in an old building. Somebody discovered bed bugs. I mean, that's not the reason. You don't tear down a building because it has bed bugs in it. And I was led to believe by someone who knows that was really a fake story anyway. So, the building is actually in excellent shape. And again, probably because they're still utilizing the first floor for the Capitol Police Department. They did about Michael, you may know, a several $1 million renovation of the power plant just recently, 2016. And so that's all been refurbished.
Yeah, they added a lot of new equipment to the building plant in 2016. Our colleague, Michael Gibson, as Paul mentioned, he did a study in 2017 where he spent a lot of time in the building and analyzed it on environmental conditions, obviously coming to the conclusion that it would need to be replaced. But really the performance of the building, as far as the envelope and everything else, is pretty good. I mean, for something that's had, and I know you guys have a shot of whiskey every time it says deferred maintenance, but this building, has had its deferred maintenance. He found some of the mechanical units, they usually write on a date, like the last time it was maintained, if they changed out filters or something, and he was finding 1966 and things like that on a lot of them.
Oh.
So there's a lot of deferred maintenance in this guy. And despite the fact that it's been sitting for 11 years empty other than the Capitol Police and, the functioning power plant, it looks pretty good. I mean, the materials are excellent. They're in sound condition. So it really kind of needs to be cleaned off. They need to replace sealant and things like that. On the interior, what he found is there's a lot of the existing drop ceilings, and unlike acoustical tile ceilings that we sort of see in your generic office buildings these days, they had a perforated aluminum ceiling system, which is quite lovely. And a lot of that is still maintained. I think on a couple floors, maybe where the police are, they tore those out to do paintball exercises or something. But the building has a lot of its original materials. There's marble in the lobby that's intact. So it's in great shape, generally speaking, and it's a robust structure. So there's no fear about its structural capacity at this point. The thing was built to last well over a century. Just as a historical point, it wasn't named the Docking Building until 1987. So we're referring it to, that was named after Robert Docking, who was a governor. And I think he was the mayor of Wichita as well when Century 2 was built. So our governor, John Carlin, in 1987, renamed it from the state office building to the Docking State Office Building. So just to clarify that, but we use the term docking kind of for its whole history.
Okay. Other than working with the legislature and through the courts, what do you guys do to try to build love for the building? Are you able to take the public on tours of it?
No, we're not.
No, and certainly since we filed this judicial appeal, no one can get in the building, at least that has a Plains Modern tag on them. So okay. I think that's a bit off limits, at least to us right now. But what we found, we've done some community events, some of it inspired by your advice, George, where we've talked to people, and I know Paul is a Topeka resident, so you know that he knows this as well. But a lot of people do have these kind of memories, not necessarily opening Christmas presents there, but this is definitely something. They had an observation they had an observation level on the 14th floor that was extremely popular. And you look at old newspapers, and they actually would write about the Girl Scout troop from whatever town, traveling up there to go to the observation deck of the Docking State Office Building. And, school groups and things like that. So it was really beloved. I found one article from 1975, I think it was, and we had Governor Bennett, I'm forgetting his first name, but he was concerned about all the state office employees in the Capitol and elsewhere spending way too much time in the Docking Building cafeteria.
Oh.
I now understand they had really good pancakes, but it must have been a great space if people are spending excess time in there to the degree that the governor had to make a public statement about it. So I think the building is beloved by, people who work there and the tourists and school groups and things like that.
There's your event, Michael. You need to have a docking building pancake breakfast.
Yeah.
And find some of those original cooks from the building to be your celebrity chefs.
Yes.
There's a great fundraising event. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Where can people get in touch with you? What's your website?
Yeah, it's plainsmodern.org. And right now it's kind of just a page that has a few links. We're going to build that into something more robust in the near future with other buildings and things on it. But we also have Instagram, Plains Modern, KAN, one word. And then Facebook, especially, where we're putting a lot of updates and links and things constantly, is Plains Modern.
Well, good luck, gentlemen. I'm looking forward to the pancake breakfast.
we are too now. That sounds delightful.
Makes me hungry.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. With Kelly Policelli on guest research, U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I will be back soon with another difficult-to-save, another modernist office building edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.